This is how I envision the RCRI Black Widow chassis. Now, one of the great things about this chassis is that you can build it in a multiple of different ways and in different styles. And with the slash-based chassis, there's a lot of different aftermarket parts that you can use and a lot of different ways that you can set your car up individually, specific to how you like it. So what I'm going to do today in this video is I'm going to tear down the chassis I'm going to tear down the RC right to the chassis, go over some of the details on the build, how I went about a few different things. Also, I'm going to try and point out a few key things to keep in mind and keep a lookout for when you're building this particular RCRI chassis, and hopefully that could help anybody out who's trying to build this chassis or looking or interested in building one of these chassis, to give you some ideas of what to expect. Alright, so this is the chassis section of the build. Now, the key thing at this point here is the rear clip and the front clip. These are both basically full units, where you can fully assemble it to the point where the last thing you need to do is just put it onto the chassis. So we have the full front clip separated here and the full rear clip separated here, and we're going to put these on the chassis. But I'm just going over what you need to make sure of when you're at this stage. So first off, depending on the battery that you have and how thick the battery is, you might need to do a lift to increase the space between the top plate and the bottom plate. Now, if you notice here, what I've done is I've used a 2.5 millimeter washer or spacer, and these I've got one on all the posts, and I have another larger one on the steering post. And this lifts the entire top plate up so I can have enough space to clear the battery inside there. And I have the servo mounted on the top. This allows me to push the battery as far as I can forward, so I can have the best weight distribution. Now, what's very, very critical is that when you're doing the assembly of the front, the chassis section, you need to make sure that your steering is very, very fluid once you've got the entire top plate screwed down. But what you need to really check is that when you tighten all these 3 screws, because this screw here is gonna pull on the chassis plate. So if you have it too low, it's gonna pull the chassis plate and you're gonna have a tight steering. So you need to make sure that once you tighten everything down, your steering is still extremely smooth. There's no jamming or anything like that. The same thing with the bearings on the steering linkage. I've got basically a spacer on there, as you can see. Depending on how you're building this kit, because it can be built in a few different ways. You can have the servo mounted on the bottom plate. You can also have the servo mounted on this side, which is the way it's actually designed for, is to actually have the servo mounted on the top over here. But to do that, you would have to run the steering linkages upside down so that you have the control arm on the side that you have the servo. The problem with doing that I found is when you flip this over, you make the steering linkage higher up, and in order to still fit everything together, you got to then move the Y brace lower down. And when you have it very, very low, it creates basically a flex point, an easier flex point. The higher up you have it, the more boxed in it is and the more secure the front section is. I've actually crashed headfirst into a concrete wall and I scratched up the shocks because of the way that I run them, but I didn't damage the actual chassis, didn't break or crack or anything like that. So the way that I have it is I have it so that the steering linkage is low and the Y plate is high, and I have it spaced just enough to clear. Now, in order to do the spacing of the steering linkage and make sure that it runs smooth, you need to use, I use two kinds of washers. I use the Traxxas washers over here and the Arma washers over here. I think that you can get basically both of them from Traxxas, both the similar kind. And I also used a larger washer here because I have it gapped out. So you notice on the bottom here, I have the fat one, which is touching the chassis plate directly. Then I have the thick washers, and between the thick washer and the actual bearing, I have the skinny washer to hold on to the just one race. And I have the same thing done on the top. Only thing is that I don't have as many spacers over there. I just have the one small spacer, the one big spacer, and that's all she needs. Now moving on to the rear section. Now what I'm running here is a short size shock tower. This comes with a mounting bracket that will allow you to mount it to your regular Traxxas or regular mounting point. I'm also running the Hot Racing aluminum transmission case and Hot Racing aluminum motor mount. I have the RPM Wheelie Bar mount or motor guard, whatever you want to call it. On the lower arms, I'm running RPM arms with STRC, either STRC or Atomic RC carriers in the back, MiP drive shafts, and I got the Traxxas red camber links. What else? Oh yeah, inside I'm running the STRC top shaft. This is to run the top gear of Traxxas with the slipper clutch of the AE models. So I'm going to show you that again once the RC is put together towards the end of the video. Inside we have the Hot Racing aluminum diff case. We got 125,000 weight oils, diff lube. We've got the Proline metal idler gear and the Traxxas metal top gear press fit onto the STRC top shaft. So this whole section here, you can actually build this with the RCRI kit, being a completely stock either Bandit rear end or slash rear end. The only things that you would have to change is if you want to make it a narrow width, you would have to change the drive shafts and the lower arms, and that would be pretty much it. You might need to change the toe links if you don't have the room to adjust them down, but you can modify them by shaving them if they're a little bit too long. On this, I also have the shocks that I'm running, which are the Mst Shocks. I'm gonna go into the whole shock setup on this car in another video, but they're basically 110 drift scale shocks. They're larger than the normal 110 drift scale shocks. Instead of being 55 millimeters with the extensions, they're 65 millimeter. So it's a bit of a longer drift shock, but it still gives me the drift shock smoothness that I like, and a very, very wide range of spring rates because I'm using a standard 10 scale spring. So I have possibly maybe 50 different sets of spring rates for these types of shocks, which is why I decided to go with this type of setup. Now I'm gonna have a video that gets more into detail about the shock setup, but for now, we're gonna go over to the front. Now for the front, I have all the Traxxas X or R red linkages. As well, I'm running the RPM front arms for the Bandit spec, same as in the Slash. I'm running a slash spec Carrier, but it's been modified to fit the bigger shaft of the Bandit, or of the Bandit arm. And then I have Atomic RC steering link, not steering linkages, but front carriers, steering blocks, whatever you want to call them. This is an STRC front bulkhead, I guess, with an RCRI front bumper. Again, using the Xtream RC or Xtream Racing Shock tower for the front. And in order to mount the RCRI front bumper, because it's actually something that's made for a Pro Mod, not for the street Eliminator, what I've done is I've made myself a little plate out of plastic, drilled some holes through it, and then used that as a mounting point for the wheelie bar itself. So it's actually, while it's carbon fiber, so it's very, very rigid, the point that it's mounted to the aluminum is plastic. So we'll have a flex point and a break point for any little small bumps, and hopefully if anything does tear apart, it'll be that and not something else. Or if anything, that will eat up a lot of the energy of the crash that I have. Now, one of the common issues with this particular build, this particular chassis, and the way that it mounts up to the front bulkhead, is that there's these two screws that end up protruding quite a bit between where the bottom of the bulkhead is and where the actual Y brace mounts up to. So in order to, as it would mount up to the top side over here, there'd be this section of exposed screws. And with the top mounted to an open screw like that, it's not fully rigid. It has play inside there, so it's not doing the job that it really should be doing. So what I've done is I use these washers here, just like so, and I basically stack them on each post until the point where the Y brace will meet up to. And so that when I screw down the Y plate to this, it's got something for it to squeeze onto, and it becomes a boxed, rigid setup, and seems to work very, very well. And at the same time, it hides those screws, so you don't have those exposed screws making the kit not look as nice as it should. All right. So on the bearings, the rear carriers, the transmission, and in the steering linkages, they're all ceramic bearings. They've been properly lubed. So one thing with ceramic bearings, unfortunately, you do need to have a high maintenance regimen with them, and you have to lube them quite often. So they're good to go for now, but after a couple of runs, gotta check them out. They might need lubing again. All right, so at this point, I can go over a couple more things in better detail. So as I was saying before, when I put the top plate on, I have the washers there bridging that gap. So you can see how there's no screw exposed, and this is nice and securely fastened there to the top plate. So this whole section is very rigid, and we still have the good motion of our steering. When doing a lift on the top plate, there's also something you got to keep in mind. The screws that go to here. Now, if you're going to raise the top plate, obviously you're going to need to have these screws be longer. So myself, I've got the top plate. I've also got a spacer underneath there that's going to raise up my body post mount. So I have extremely long screws to go in there. So it's very important to make sure that you have the screws here that are long enough for however high you're gonna have your top plate set up. When doing the front end section, there's a few key things to keep in mind when you're doing the build. You want to have the least amount of camber gain, and you want to have the least amount of bump steer. in order to make sure that as you're going up and down, your angles are not changed at all, like so, you need to make sure that these three top arm, lower arm, and steering link are all at the same angle as they go up and down, as you can see that there. And for the camber gain, you got to make sure that the whole position is as close inward or outwards to the position of the lower arm mount. And it's the same thing for the outside. So yeah, with that, that's mostly for the front suspension. Now, when it comes to my shock position, you can actually have them on the outside or on the inside going in here. The reason I have these on the outside is because I'm trying to get as much weight as I can, as far forward as I can. And by mounting them here, I'm just getting that little bit of extra weight forward. And yeah, that's basically it for the chassis up to this point. And I'll put some more stuff on it and I'll come back. Alright, so this is basically the raw chassis as it is, with no wheels and the body post setup not installed. I do have the Proline body mount setup, front and back, and I have a plate that goes over here to mount the front body post parts, because since this is not on an angle due to the straight up and down reversed bulkhead, you need to use a different method in order to secure the body. And these posts here accommodate the plate that I have for it. So yeah, the front body post go like either this or like this, depending on what body that you have. And yeah, just going over the build. I'm running the R1 Wurks Digital 3 ESC. I've got a rocket fan on there, got the Wi-Fi module, and I'm using the upgraded cap pack setup from R1. For the motor, I got a Surpass 4.5 V4S. The chassis itself is the RCRI Black Widow Street Eliminator version. The Black Widow is basically a Pro Mod, and this is the chassis that was built based on the Black Widow Pro Mod. So I know there's another, the original RCRI Street Eliminator chassis that a lot of folks were calling the Black Widow. It's not really a Black Widow. This is the Black Widow. And what else do I got going on here? Yeah, we got the Mst Shocks. It's Bandit spec with both RPM Bandit arms in the front and the rear. We've got aluminum carriers at all four corners. We also got aluminum C-hubs. These are slash C-hubs that have been modified to fit the Bandit arms. I'm running R1 10K 130C, a 10K mAh 130C 2S battery. So one of the reason that I made sure to do the top plate lift here is so that I can fit this battery in here and be able to switch between this battery and this battery. The reason for that is because the higher mAh battery is basically going to give me a higher mAh battery, which is going to hold voltage better, but it's also going to give me more weight. The different batteries that I'm running, so I have a light battery and I have a heavy battery, so I can adjust the weight balance with these. It allows me to push the battery very far forward, so I can have a better weight balance, more weight to the forward, because it's already a very rear heavy car, being that it's a rear motor setup. Another main thing is that the bulkhead is in a reverse position. So instead of being on a kick up angle of 30 degrees, having a 30 degrees caster, because the bulkhead is flipped around, it's got zero kick up, so there's zero caster. So the wheels stay true when it's driving. They're not gaining camber when you're trying to steer, making it carve while you're trying to make corrections. This will make you steer more true. The only kicker to this is because it's zero, and there's usually a little bit of forward rake. My suggestion is always to have at least 1 or 2 degrees static camber, so that because of the rake, when you make a steering correction, it's not putting a positive camber dynamically on the wheels. A little bit of static camber will make sure that it doesn't do that. Another benefit to this chassis is that the rear motor and shock tower is not actually connected to the top plate, other than by this turnbuckle and mounting point right here. It's floating on this side here, and it's connected over here. So that basically allows there to be a twist and flex between the top plate and where the transmission and motor is mounted. So by adjusting the turnbuckles here, you can actually add tweak to either side of the chassis. Now, as for the slipper clutch, what I'm running is a RD Revolution design slipper clutch that's made for the Team Associated, I think it's the B5 series. And this is a triple slipper plate clutch setup, so that if you do have slip put into it, you have 2 slipper plates on this side here, and you have a third one on the other side with another pressure plate. So it's being squeezed on both sides, like kind of like a caliper, I guess. Anyways, you can squeeze this down and tighten this as fully possible to get it as close to locked as you should ever need to have it. There's a big debate between running a locked slipper clutch, running a fully locked diff. Now, that's a personal preference. I'm not going to knock anybody for doing their setups how they do. I don't suggest people lock their diff or lock their slipper clutch. You can actually use the slipper clutch to help you launch. So if it's launching way too hard, you can use the slipper clutch to make the hit a little bit easier, so you're not spinning in hard circles right off the line. It makes it a little bit easier to take off, and that's a tuning feature that you have. And if you ever want to lock it up more, you can just squeeze it down as tight as possible, and it won't slip for the most part. And in any slip that it does have, I'd rather have it slipping than that going through the transmission and tearing apart the gears inside the transmission. Most of the guys that you see hearing about having to change top gears, idler gears, and stuff like that are guys that are locking things down. Guys that don't have the slipper clutch locked down or don't have the diff completely locked, for the most part, they don't run into torn transmission issues. That's something to keep in mind. Now, if you go ahead and lock yours, that's personal preference, but as far as my kits and the things that I suggest, I don't suggest to lock that down ever. So that would be the slipper setup that I have here. And the only reason I'm able to run this is because of, as I said before, I have the STRC top shaft in there. That gives me the ability to run these slipper clutches, and it's also a press fit. It's set up so that it's conical, and that when you put the metal top gear onto the shaft itself, you need to actually press fit it on there. So there's no play, there's no slop whatsoever. It's on pretty darn tight. One of the key things to keep in mind when you're building a rear motor no prep car is that it's already an extremely rear heavy car. So we got to do as much things as we can to shift weight forward so that we're balancing out the weight of the car, getting more weight onto the wheels that are steering the car, and get the thing to go more straight. So when you're putting the wheelie bar on, you want to get the lightest possible wheelie bar that you can get. Now this is a 9-inch wheelie bar. I also have a 10-inch wheelie bar that I'm going to be trying, and I think the rules allow a bit of a longer wheelie bar than that. So I'm going to be exploring with some other wheelie bars to see if I can't get a longer one that's going to work out for me. The key thing here is that I'm running carbon fiber wheelie bars in the back, and I won't run aluminum. The aluminum is too heavy, and it's already a rear heavy car. I also won't run the G10 carbon fiberglass, I think it is. I had broken my wheelie bar and was using a friend's fiberglass, G10 fiberglass wheelie bar, and the weight difference was ridiculous. I didn't think it would be that much of a big deal, but it actually forced me to have to change my spring setup in order to accommodate the heavier weight of the wheelie bar in the back. So when dealing with a rear motor car that's already rear heavy, I suggest going with a wheelie bar that's as light as possible. As far as my opinion on the RCRI chassis, personally I love it. I find it's a great chassis, and it does, the issue with it is it's a very pro builder's chassis. There's a lot of tweaking that you need to do with a lot of different washers and spacers, and figuring out how to set up the suspension so there's no camber gain, there's no bump steer. You need to know how to do all of those kinds of things in order to set this chassis up right. Knowing how to set all those angles up and get those aspects of the build in check. Otherwise, you're going to have a car going all over the place. You need to know how to make sure your turnbuckles are all loose and turn correctly. You need to know how to add spacers to the steering linkages to make sure they turn freely with no rough spots, tight spots, or anything like that. So it's a very complicated chassis to build, but I mean, if you do have any experience building RC chassis, building no prep cars, it'll be no problem for you. For a first-time builder, I would suggest to get a little bit more familiar with building RCs and building a no prep car before you try and tackle a chassis that takes this much. It takes quite a bit of experience to know the little odds and ends on how to do things to get it to work right. I hope I've been able to show this chassis to anybody that's been curious about it. I hope you guys like my build, and if you have any questions on it, any questions about anything I've done, any reasons why I might have done anything, let me know in the comments. I try to respond to all the comments, and I'm going to give more videos on this build before the next season starts. I'm going to do a specific build on going over the shock setup, going over the angles that I have set up on the front and things like that. So I'm going to hopefully be able to answer any questions that people have in those videos, and if I don't, and if you have any more, just shoot them at me. Yeah, with that, if you like the video, think it's helpful, give it a like. Think the video sucks, go ahead and throw it a thumbs down. And if you want to see more content like this, give me a sub. All right, so have yourself a good night.